Welcome back to Module 1, the first Americans, roughly to 1550, but we might wiggle that date around a little bit. And our focus on this short lecture today is going to be briefly to talk about some of the pre-Columbian Europe, the elements of European society that we'll need to understand. We're going to describe, not in depth at all, but we're going to describe a variety of pre-Columbian indigenous societies in the Americas. And then our main focus is going to be exploring the major differences or some major differences between European and indigenous world views. And my cat is being really obnoxious, so she's going to be really loud during this whole thing. There's no stopping her. So if you hear weird noises in the background, that's what's going on today. I don't know why she has a bell. I don't know who gave it to her. All right, you begin. Let's talk about early modern Europe. The period that we describe as early modern is between the medieval period and the modern period. When historians talk about modern Europe, by the way, they're talking about 1500 to 1750. So that might not seem very modern to you. Early modern Europe, then you're really talking right at that moment of colonization, right in 1491. We would describe this as early modern Europe. And what was early modern Europe like? Well, let me tell you a little bit about it. Okay, she's being quiet now. So what was Europe like? What kind of ideas about freedom did Europe have? When Europeans colonized the New World, they had multiple ideas of freedom as a collection of rights and privileges, most of which were reserved for a small portion of the population, the people at the top. There's no concept yet in Europe of universal rights, universal freedoms, universal liberties. That's going to come later with the European Enlightenment, or the Atlantic World Enlightenment, I should say. One important idea of freedom was religious freedom or moral liberties. Now, we hear moral liberties, religious freedom, we think the right to practice your religion without interference from the state, right? That's what religious freedom means to us today. That is not what religious freedom or moral liberties meant to Europeans. Rather, this was the liberty to subordinate yourself to the Christian God and to subordinate yourself to whatever the church was, the official state church of your country. So if you're, as we'll see in the 1500s, if your country changes from Catholic to Protestant, you just changed religions as well. Oh my God, let me just kick this cat out. People, you're ruining my video. All right. And this idea of moral liberty did not leave room for non-Christians. So for instance, in Spain, before Spanish colonization, Spain's first colonization effort was the Reconquista, where through methods such as the Spanish Inquisition, they rooted out and expelled any non-Christians like Muslims and Jews who had been living in Spain. So we want to sort of separate our idea of religious freedom from early modern Europe. Very, very different ideas. What about secular ideas about freedom? Again, the freedom that the early modern Europeans will talk about is the freedom to obey the law. Individual liberty is individual obedience to law and acceptance of one's rank and duties within a very rigid and extensive social hierarchy, ranging from the urban poor and rural peasants way at the bottom to church officials, hereditary aristocrats and nobles, and kings and queens at the top. And there were a lot more poor people than there were nobles, church officials, and kings and queens at the top. When we think about European social hierarchy, then I want us to look at this image. And this is one of the images of early modern Europe that helps us understand what European social hierarchy was like circa 1491. And we can understand this European worldview at the moment of colonization, the moment that colonization begins. We can encapsulate this early modern worldview through what historians call the Great Chain of Being. Now, peasants in France weren't wandering around every day like, how's the Great Chain of Being treating you today? Love it. Love to be part of the Great Chain of Being. This is historians call the Great Chain of Being, this complicated set of European worldviews that are creating their worldview. But we have, or creating their sort of idea about the universe, I should say. But we have some of these depictions from early modern artists that this was what the world, this is how they conceptualized the universe. And if you look here at the top, you see God. Underneath God, the heavenly host. Below the heavenly host, more angels. Europeans loved to categorize things, and there were like dozens of categories of different angels and different types of angels that there might be. And then there's humans, birds, animals. Down here, you can barely see it. There's a unicorn. Why not? Trees and rocks. And of course, down at the very bottom is Satan. This tells us a lot. This is part of a world in which everything radiates out from the earth, right? This is not a heliocentric universe. This is an earth-centric universe. And the further out you get, the closer to God you get. So the higher up you get, the closer to God you get. And you'll notice that these categories are very fixed. And we can take this slice out and we can move it over here and we could create another chain with kings, nobles, church officials, the middling sort, artisans, and the vast peasantry at the bottom. Each of these slices can be pulled out and ranked individually. And early modern Europeans did. They ranked what birds were better? Well, the ones that flew higher and were closer to God. What trees are better? The ones that grow taller and closer to God. What angels are better? I don't know, what the seraphs, right, at the top, the big angels. So all of these categories can be pulled out to create even more complicated categories. That's part of the Great Chain of Being. Everything has a place and everything should stay in its place. The only movement that we see in this depiction is downward. The only movement is angels who have stepped outside of their natural place and have fallen down into hell. This is not a ladder. A tree doesn't become a unicorn any more than a peasant could become a king. The idea here is fixity. Now, that's very different than our own conception. We still have hierarchy, of course, today, but we also have a worldview in America in the 21st century that says social mobility is good. You're all in college because you want to, through education, accumulation of some wealth, get ahead, right? Rise up in your social class. That social mobility is a very, very new concept. Europeans don't have it in 1491. Rather, what was the right thing to do, rather than try and get ahead, was be happy where you are and be content knowing that your reward will not be on this earth, but in heaven. When most people in Europe are poor, when most of the lands and the wealth has already been accumulated by those nobles, church officials, and kings and queens, that was the message to the masses of Europeans. Be happy where you are, your reward will come in heaven. This is going to be challenged through the process of colonization. Because keep in mind, early modern Europeans, they thought they knew everything. They were like, yeah, we know all the things, and all the things are in their place. And then they found two new continents that they didn't know existed, found them, encountered them, ran into them, learned about them for the first time, two new continents that they didn't know existed, and a whole bunch of people that they didn't know. Well, where do these people go in our great chain of being? And new foods. What's an avocado? Where do I put that in the hierarchy of fruits and vegetables? What the heck is it? and the opportunities, the economic opportunities that will be created by the massive transfer of resources and wealth from the Americas to Europe is going to create new possibilities for people that had no social mobility. Think about Columbus's men, right? This is going to create opportunities for them to become socially mobile. When we talk about the Columbian Exchange, when we talk about the changes, of course, we're going to see dramatic changes in the Americas, including the demographic disaster, genocide, almost 90% of the indigenous population gone within 100 years of Columbus's landfall. But we also want to understand that this is going to change Europe in really fundamental ways as well. All right. Europe didn't really, they didn't really know. And by the way, I'm squishing all of Europe together here. That's what I'm doing today. All of Europe is getting squished. I'm flattening a lot of like variety. I'll be doing the same over in the Americas. But this was the known world. In the 15th century, it was mostly this part here. This area here is what Romans called the bowl of the world. And you see on this 1507 map, this is very intricate, filled in, looks like Europe. The further out you get, the dodgier it looks. This is India, I believe, or it might be, I think this might be India. I think this might be Asia. You can see that they've got the outside of Africa. The map maker had to make a little extra space because they were still discovering things as he was making this map. They got the outline pretty good. They have no idea what's in the interior yet. They still think there's unicorns in there. And you can see over here, both continents. And they nailed it in 1507. This is an absolutely perfect map of the Americas, right? No, this is North America. This is the Caribbean. You can see here that they didn't realize that there's actually a lot more over here that they haven't encountered yet. So when the Pope splits the continent here, the Pope says to stop Portugal and Spain from fighting with each other. He says, I'm going to split it down the middle. He doesn't realize that he's splitting it unevenly because there's a lot more yet to be discovered. Not discovered, a lot more yet to learn about, let's say that. Okay, let's head over here. Let's head over to the Americas and let's talk about a couple of indigenous societies. And then we're going to talk about, well, where's the heart of the conflict between the worldviews of the Europeans and indigenous people? All right, when we hop over to the Americas, I'm going to talk about the Aztecs and everybody else. All right, so here's the Aztecs, here's everybody else, because the Aztecs are very different. The Aztecs look a little bit more like Europe than the other indigenous societies that we'll encounter. This is an empire. This is an empire of city-states, so Tenochtitlan, dominating other city-states, as you can see here in the, where is it? This one, in the map of the empire. This is a very hierarchical society, of course, with Moctezuma at the very top, where you have those elite religious folk, you have elite hereditary nobles, just like in Europe. You have that hierarchy that's rigid in the Aztec Empire. Of course, it's supported by vast numbers of peasantry and rural poor. A lot of these, this is going to look very similar in this idea of hierarchy and differentiation. So the lives of nobles are very, very different than the lives of peasants. We're going to see that less and less as we move north into indigenous societies. But here in the Aztec Empire, that's very much that's very similar to Europe. And if we go back to, of course, our Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan had a population probably between 100,000 and 400,000, which made it one of the largest cities in the world in 1491. It's much larger than London at the time, for instance, which is still kind of it's not great yet. You probably don't want to visit London quite yet. No, it's pretty great. All right. I am saying a lot of things. So the Aztec capital is populous. It has fabulous irrigation. Their agriculture is unrivaled. We have canals, zoos, walled gardens. Wealthy people live in beautiful apartments full of al fresco paintings and rooftop gardens. But that's a small sliver of that population, right? Most of the people in the Aztec Empire are rural poor or peasants or enslaved, for instance, enslaved as a result of war, so prisoners of war. And of course, you know that Aztecs famously, infamously practiced human sacrifice. When Cortez makes his landfall, is given Malintzin, who has been enslaved, and eventually marches on the Aztecs and defeats Moctezuma. One of the benefits to Cortez is that this is a moment of unrest. The Aztec Empire is going through a series of droughts. Moctezuma has become a very unpopular ruler, and he's increased human sacrifices to try and set the boat right. So he's become even less popular as he's demanding tribute and demanding human sacrifice from the other city states that he controls. So Cortez has the benefit of a lot of people in the Aztec Empire not being a fan of Moctezuma. In fact, there's a suggestion that Cortez benefits from the idea that there was a religious prophecy that someone was going to come and remove Moctezuma from power. He might have benefited from that idea that, oh, the person is here. He's here to save us from Cortez. And this is a good reminder that when Europeans encountered our indigenous populations, they had their own stuff going on. The Aztec Empire, this enormous, complex, remember that 100,000 to 400,000, that's just in Tenochtitlan, that's just in the major city. So they had their own complexities, their own economic systems, their own social systems, and their own concerns, right? That, hey, maybe these new people that have just arrived will be an ally to help us get what we're trying to get, which is the end of Moctezuma's rule. So keep that in mind. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about the Aztecs and then everyone else. This is just a Rivera painting of the great city of Tenochtitlan from 1945. You may have seen this painting. As we move north, our indigenous societies become less complex, not the people. The people are just as complex as people in Tenochtitlan, but the social structures, the economic systems, the hierarchies become less complex and less differentiated. So as we move north into, for example, the Shawnee of present-day Ohio, they're going to have a chief, right? They're going to have spiritual leaders, a medicine man, but they're not going to be so far removed from everyone else. Their lives aren't going to be so different than everyone else's. So it's not as hierarchical. Less literate, so less need for having written documents, having mathematics, right? If you're not involved in this enormous, complex society, but just as creative, just as capable, and just as interesting as we move north. I just like this map because it talks about what people eat. It divides indigenous people up into basically what they ate. And you'll notice that down here, of course, our Taino Arawak Indians were orchard growers, and they hunted alligators to eat as well. But I also wanted to compare this map to this. I'm sorry, this is a very bad map, but it shows the connections, the trade connections between these indigenous societies. So people in our Taino Arawak in Haiti were part of a vast trade network that extended all the way up to present day Alaska, which is why you can find panther teeth in archaeological sites in Minneapolis, or in Minnesota, I should say, because this is a vast trade network. Moving north, so we're going to move from the Aztecs and sort of creep up north, just stopping in to visit a couple of societies. We're not going into depth, but this is Pueblo Bonita in Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico. And the rectangular structures here are the foundations of dwellings. The circular ones are kivas, or places of religious worship. So we're still seeing complex ideas about religion, spirituality. We're still seeing, as we move north, some fantastic architecture. We're just not as complex, as dense, or as hierarchical as the Aztecs. This is the Anasazi White House in the Canyon de Chelly. This is present day Arizona. if you have a chance to go, or if you haven't seen it yet, if you have a chance to go down there, it's really great live in person. This was built sometime between 300 and 1300 CE. CE means Common Era. It's the same as AD, it's just a different terminology. So it was built sometime between 300 and 1300. Then it was abandoned after 1300 during a period of drought, and then sporadically occupied until the Navajo resettled it in the 1700s. I show the Anasazi White House carved right into the side of an enormous cliff, not just so that we can be impressed by the architecture, but we don't want to think of Native American people as static. That this was built, abandoned, reoccupied, this change and development before Columbus came is part of the story of Native Americans. So we don't ever want to think of course, Native American societies as static. All right. Going to keep moving north. We're now all the way up to southern Illinois. Cahokia, Illinois was one of the largest settlements in North America. As many as 6,000 to possibly up to 40,000 people lived in Cahokia at the settlement there. You see, of course, this pyramid-shaped, a pyramid's a good shape. Solid at the bottom, reaches up to the sky. Wasn't aliens. But we see this religious structure here that, of course, shows a lot of knowledge about the universe, knowledge about the stars, knowledge about, oh, excuse me, the movement of the earth. All right. This structure was built by the people of Cahokia, Illinois, present-day Illinois, who were part of what we call the Mississippi Mound Builders. That is a string of societies along the Mississippi River, primarily, that built fabulous earthen structures, the most famous of which is probably Serpent Mound. This is the largest existing mound structure in the Americas. It's in present-day Ohio. It is 1,300 feet long. It was probably built between about 1000 to 1500 CE. White people first saw it in 1848. Today, the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma consider this, it's their sacred site, one of their sacred sites. How is a tribe from Oklahoma connected to the Serpent Mound? The Shawnee tribe's ancestral land was present-day Ohio. They were forcibly removed from Ohio and pushed to Oklahoma as part of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We most associate that act with the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears, but it affected numerous tribes. And today there's no federally recognized tribes living in Ohio. All right. The Shawnee have claimed this mound. The claim has been denied in court, and they've expressed a lot of anger at outlandish conspiracy theories about the mound. Outlandish conspiracy theories that remove Native Americans from its history. What kind of outlandish ideas do you think I've been talking about? That's right, ancient aliens. Let's pause. Let's talk about ancient aliens. Ancient Aliens is a little bit racist. You know Ancient Aliens. It's on the History Channel. It's the guy with the hair. And he's like, I can't tell you that aliens did it, but I think aliens did it. And this idea originates, I don't know where it originates from, but the idea is that surely people in the past couldn't have built pyramids and ziggurats and Stonehenge and Serpent Mound. Surely people in the past couldn't have built these things. It must have been aliens. Now, a lot of them are ripe for that because this is best viewed from the sky. But they're not making this for aliens. They're making this for spirits that live in the sky. But I said ancient aliens is a little bit racist. There's something really wrong here when you're saying surely Black and brown people of the past couldn't have built these things. It must have been aliens. And it's fundamentally disrespectful to people of the past to say, if we can't figure out how they made it, it must have been aliens. It couldn't have been people in the past. They're just as smart as us. They just have different knowledge. They're just as funny as us. We just would not get each other's jokes. This has led, this idea, this conspiracy theory, this sort of ancient aliens mindset for Serpent Mound has led to a lot of New Age practitioners claiming to interpret the energy of the mounds, including a man who calls himself Three Eagles. He claims Cherokee heritage. It's a little bit dodgy. And these New Age practitioners will go to Serpent Mound and they'll put crystals in the mound. They're actually damaging it. And the Shawnee tribe cannot get their claim, they can't protect this mound because their claim to it has been denied. So this idea of ancient aliens, you might be like, well, that's just kind of silly, but it does actually do some harm. When Serpent Mound is literally being harmed because of these ideas about being able to connect with some sort of alien energy through crystals. You can look it up if you want to know more about all of that. All right. I want to shift now to our last bit of conversation. And I want to talk about what were some of the major sources of conflicting worldviews between Europeans and Native Americans. Now, I am flattening both Europeans all into one, and I'm flattening Native Americans. We're talking about the not Aztecs now. I'm flattening all of them into one. In module 2, we'll talk about a little bit more about differences, for instance, between Spanish and English colonization, but here we're kind of smushing them together. So I want to talk about 3 real focuses of conflicting worldviews: religion, land and property, and work and gender. And I put work and gender together because they're together in important ways. Where was the conflict? Let's talk about land. It's an oversimplification. And in fact, we're repeating a European justification if we say, oh, well, you know, Native Americans just didn't believe in private property, so anyone could use the land. Native Americans did not have the European notions of private property, but their ideas of property were land usage, and it was connected to families, communities, and relationships with other tribes. So they had very concrete and complex ideas about who should use the land and how and when. This is one of the reasons that Native Americans fight wars with each other over who's using what land, how, and when. But unlike the Europeans, they're not fencing it in and saying, this is mine, it'll be my son's, it'll be his sons after him. One of the ways that we can think about this idea of, it's just a very different conception of land, is looking at this map. This map, it's a Catawba map, C-A-T-A-W-B-A. This was created by a Catawba person for a English governor of South Carolina. This was created a little bit later in 1721. So the governor says, draw us a picture of your land. And here's what the Catawba person draws. All these little, you would be like, so did their land like was round? Is this like a different person's land and they're all in these round shapes? No. What this Catawba person drew was, it says, show me your land, your place where you control and where you live. And what they drew was a series of relationships. These are all tribal relationships and the connections between them. You can see some are very distantly connected. You can see that some of these relationships are less significant than others. That's how they understood land usage. This was these were alliances and agreements created who's going to use what land, when, and how. And the Catawba person also drew the English settlement over here. And you see that he drew it in these little rectangles that the English had fenced their land in. It was very delineated. You can imagine a situation then when Catawba people first encountering English colonists, new people, maybe they'll be our allies, maybe they'll be our trade partners. This is excellent. You can imagine an English person saying, I'm going to farm this. You'd be like, yes, of course, new friend. This is part of our friendship building. You can definitely farm this year. You come back the next year, the English person has fenced it in and says, this is mine now. That's a very different conception, but it does not mean that Native Americans then said, oh, okay, anyone can have the land or use the land. This idea that, well, Native Americans just didn't believe in private property is going to be used as a justification of the Europeans to say they're not using the land rights. We're going to go in and take it. What about religion? We have a lot of primary sources from priests, Jesuit French priests in present day Canada, of course, Spanish priests down in the missions and elsewhere, as you know. And some of their descriptions of Native American religion are really strange. This is a 17th century, excuse me, a 1600s engraving by a French Jesuit priest, and you can see here that over the shaman, the medicine man, over him is hovering the devil. When religious leaders, indigenous religious leaders, told Jesuits and other priests that they talk to spirits, they interpret, they make requests of spirits, interpret their demands. Jesuits didn't look at them and say, yeah, right, you talk to spirits. They believed them. They said, oh, we definitely believe you talk to spirits, but those spirits are devils that you are being tricked by. That's the Catholic first and later just more broadly Christian perspective. Yes, they believed religious leaders when they said that they communed with spirits, but they thought or assumed or wrote their biblical interpretation onto that as they were communing with the devil. So for these priests, this becomes a matter of saving people's souls, that they'll do anything up to and including murder as long as it saves people's souls from this accidental devil worship. There's also a lot of there's one description of a French Jesuit, and he says, yeah, these people don't have religion. They do have old men who commune with spirits on their behalf. And I'm like, old men who, you just described priests, you're describing yourself. But if it wasn't a single monotheistic God that looked like the Christian God, it was not real, not a religion, or accidental devil worship. All right. I put gender and work together. Yeah. Gender is going to be a big source of conflict between Europeans and indigenous people. And one of the conflicts is through different labor roles. So you know that 10,000 years ago, it was probably women that invented agriculture. And think about that. That makes perfect sense. If women need to stay closer to hearth and home, because they're usually the ones tending small children, it makes sense that women are going to invent agriculture. It made sense in North America for women to be doing most of the agricultural work in Native American societies while men hunted and fished. That made sense as a way to divide work up by gender. Europeans, though, came in and they looked at this and they thought it was all backwards, because in European society, men were largely responsible for agriculture. Of course, though, at harvest time, all hands in, that women were doing just as much work to keep farms running, but they associated agricultural work with men. And wealthy Europeans associated hunting and fishing with leisure. That was something wealthy Europeans did for fun. So Europeans, especially the English, will come in and say, oh my God, look at what they're doing to their poor women, making them work while these lazy men go out and fish all day. They're again going to use this as justification. They're going to use this to say Native Americans aren't as civilized because they don't divvy up work the way that we do along gendered lines. They're going to use that to say they're less civilized. It gets even more complicated though, and there's going to be elements of Native American, what we would call gender and sexuality, that are going to make Europeans lose their minds. Many Native American societies were fairly permissive about premarital sex. Most had ways that people could divorce each other, that women could instigate a divorce if they had to show mistreatment, but that was on the table. That many North American societies are matrilineal, not matriarchal, not run by women, but family lines go through the mother. This makes a lot of sense, right? So they're very different in ways that Europeans are going to be aghast at. And Europeans are going to, first the Spanish, later the French and others, are going to be very distressed by what we now term two-spirit. Two-spirit is originally an Ojibwe term. We use it now to describe a variety of Native American societies that practice or recognize non-binary genders. So I'm just going to give you some examples. 19th century fur trader in his diary. He's in Crow territory in Montana. And he says, strange country this, where males assume the dress and perform the duties of females while women turn men and mate with their own sex. He's trying to figure out, this looks different. What is happening here? What he's describing in part is this two-spirit. Some of the earliest descriptions we have of non-binary gender expression in the Americas come from Europeans. And they come from, like I said, French, English, Spanish. So this is fairly widespread that we have multiple societies here and multiple primary sources from Europeans, often priests, and this really colored their perceptions. So Spanish conquistador de Vaca referred to, quote, effeminate, impotent men who were married to other men and, quote, go about covered up like women, and they do the work of women, but they also draw the bow and carry very heavy loads. You can see Europeans like, but I'm confused. And this was in present day Texas that de Vaca was describing. You may have heard the term two-spirit before. You may have heard an older term, Berdacci, which is what French missionaries called Native Americans who were not gender conforming. Berdacci is actually an older and offensive term. It means male prostitute. And this is one of the conflicts, that the only way that Europeans could understand these non-binary genders was through what we would call sexuality. So they ascribed to this a deviant sexuality of homosexuality. That was the only way that they could figure out how to conceptualize it. And this colored their response to it. In 1513, Vasco de Balboa set his troops, dogs, I should say, on 40 Cueva Indians that he believed to be sodomites, because he saw them as men who had assumed the roles of women. And we see that murder depicted by Theodore de Bry, the artist we looked at in our last module. Now, gender expression, of course, varied between tribes, but we have a lot of pre-Columbian societies that created space for multiple genders. These societies acknowledged anywhere from 3 to 5 gender roles: female, male, two-spirit female, two-spirit male, and what we might call transgender, that they acknowledged that some people would exhibit multiple genders throughout their lifetime. Why am I not calling these people trans or gay or lesbian? Well, in 1989, a group of LGBT Native Americans met in Ottawa, and they decided to adopt this traditional term of two-spirit from the Ojibwe language to describe themselves. Why a separate term? Why not call themselves LGBTQ+, right? One of the reasons that Native Americans have re-embraced this idea of two-spirit is that they're rejecting Western categories of gender and sexuality. Western categories of gender and sexuality often separate gender and sexuality from religious and spiritual practice. The idea of the two-spirit is reuniting those older practices in which gender, sexuality, and spirituality were much more entwined. What else do I want to tell you about the two spirits? How many societies practiced or acknowledged non-binary genders? We're not sure, probably close to 200 pre-Columbian societies. The Cheyenne, the Yuke, the Zuni, the Ojibwe all had words that translate very clunkily into English as half men, half women, man, woman. Many societies did give young people a choice about their gender. And status and roles also differed from group to group over time. Some societies did see two spirits as possessing supernatural powers, that they were closer to the spiritual. On the other hand, some, like the Aztecs and the Incas, may have actually denigrated two spirits, that they were not seen as the special and spiritual people for the Aztecs and the Incas. All right, this photograph, obviously not from pre-Columbian society because it's a photograph. It's a photograph of Oshtish, a 19th century Crow two-spirit who was also called Finds Them and Kills Them for their bravery in battle. What a great name, Finds Them and Kills Them. When not fighting in battle, Oshtish took on traditionally feminine attire and a role in their community. All right. That's all I want to tell you today. In module 2, we're gonna move up back into North America. We're going to come up over here, talk about English colonization. For today, you want to, or for this module, you want to wrap up your reflection on Columbus. There's a little lecture exit exam, just a couple of quick questions, won't take you more than a minute, and I will see you in the next module. Have a great one.